Cultural é de graça. Filme, fotografe e poste sempre usando a hashtag BigFestival2018. Aproveite.
Acelerar mudanças, mixar linguagens, deletar fronteiras, transformar realidades. Porque o futuro é hoje. É arte, ciência e tecnologia abrindo multipossibilidades. Oi Futuro, em todas as regiões do país, apoiando projetos que encontram você e milhões de brasileiros. A gente conecta, transforma e transcende. Oi, junto é bem melhor.
Já imaginou como o mundo seria sem filmes, desenhos e séries? O BNDES faz a diferença para tirar do papel as produções audiovisuais brasileiras, levando essas produções do Brasil para o mundo e conquistando prêmios internacionais. E além disso, o BNDES investe em salas de cinema por todo o país, fazendo com que todo mundo possa sentir de perto a magia do cinema. BNDES. Onde tem BNDES, tem desenvolvimento.
A Dow, líder mundial da indústria química, apoia ações de cidadania corporativa com o compromisso de avançar o progresso humano. Essas ações são baseadas em 3 pilares: soluções para a força de trabalho, soluções de negócios e soluções para a comunidade. As ações dentro do pilar de soluções para a força de trabalho visam capacitar educadores e aumentar o interesse dos estudantes nas áreas de ciência, tecnologia, engenharia e matemática. Trabalhando iniciativa STEM, a Dow colabora para construir a força de trabalho do amanhã.
Bom dia, pessoal. Bem-vindos ao segundo dia de painéis do Big Festival 2018. A gente vai falar agora aqui um painel de um game que eu gosto muito, que é Firewatch. Design de narrativa é game design. Então, vou chamar aqui logo os convidados, só lembrando vocês que vocês podem mandar perguntas para a gente pelo aplicativo do Big Festival 2018. Basta baixar no celular, o Wi-Fi aqui do Centro Cultural é de graça, você baixa, vai na palestra de hoje, do dia de hoje aqui que a gente está assistindo, manda a pergunta, no final a gente tem um tablet e a gente lê as perguntas aqui para os participantes, tá? Então, vou chamar aqui ao palco para conversar com vocês e falar um pouquinho Arthur Protásio, da Fableware Narrative Design, e também Remo, da Campo Santo. Palmas para eles. Bom painel.
Valeu, obrigado.
Hello, my name is Remo. I am a game designer, a writer, and a composer who currently works at Valve. But before a few months ago, I was part of Campo Santo, which was a group of about a dozen team members in San Francisco. In 2016, we released our debut game, Firewatch, and on that game I worked on the game design, the story, I composed the music, and I did the game's audio as well. So earlier this year, Campo Santo agreed to become part of Valve, as you see, and there we'll be making our next game, In the Valley of Gods, which is an adventure story about 2 women shooting a film in 1920s Egypt. A slight little bit more about me. Before Firewatch, I worked at Double Fine. Before that, I worked at Irrational Games. I've worked in just various different capacities over the years. I co-wrote a game called The Cave with Ron Gilbert. I did the music for a game called Gone Home, another game called 30 Flights of Loving. I recently wrote Star Wars X-Wing VR experience for Battlefield 2, so that's me. But anyway, moving on. Today, I am going to be talking about Firewatch and how we ended up with the game that you maybe played. It's been 2 years since the game came out, so there will be some spoilers today. I'm sorry. But very briefly, Firewatch is a first-person exploration and narrative game set in the forest. It's a story about a man named Henry who takes a job as a fire lookout as his marriage is falling apart, his wife is sick, and he sort of runs away. And then the player spends the entire game in contact with his supervisor named Delilah over a handheld radio while increasingly strange events intrude onto what was supposed to be a quiet summer. So the idea for the setting and general tone of Firewatch we had very early. The game's writer, Sean Vanneman, wanted to set the game in the Wyoming wilderness, which is where he grew up. And the premise of the game, the basic story of the game, that you go out to this forest and then things become strange and suspenseful, we had that established very early, and the visual design by our art director, Ollie Moss, and you can see what the sort of visual design of the game looked like, we had that really early as well. But the game design, we didn't exactly know what it was going to be. We didn't really know what players were going to be doing in this game when we started making it. So we knew we would have a lot of interactive dialogue. We knew that would be a big, big part of the game. But we also knew that we did not have the team size or the budget to put a lot of other people in the game, at least not at a level of visual fidelity that we wanted to hit. So what do you do? What do you do in a story game where you can't afford to put a lot of characters in it? We came up with the idea of communicating with Delilah over the walkie-talkie pretty early. We prototyped that early on, and after we decided that part would work, we actually just started making the game. We started making the game before we even had any kind of overall game design. But we had lots of weird mechanical ideas that we didn't end up using, things like spotting fires with the interactive firefinder. We built out a prototype for that, didn't put it in the game. We had an idea for sort of drawing lines on your map to triangulate locations, which was inspired by a game called Miasmata. If anyone here has ever played that, we were really inspired by that early on, and we thought it would be a fun way to explore the world. Way too complicated for the game that we were making. And ultimately, what we realized the game needed was nothing more than what the game's themes demand. We were sort of insecure early on about how much of a game our game needed to feel like. We thought we needed all these different mechanics and all these different systems in the game in order for players to want to play it. And I think it was really good to go through that exercise, but ultimately I think the most important thing that I learned making this game was that we shouldn't put more in it than what the game actually needs. So here are some sort of basic principles of the interactive dialogue in Firewatch. Oops, what am I doing wrong here? Nope, there we go. So there are three important principles to interactive dialogue in Firewatch. One, dialogue choices are mutually exclusive, which means that once you choose one option, the other dialogue options are gone forever. You can't sort of work through all of the trees until you see all of the content, like you can in a lot of adventure games or RPGs. Two, most dialogue responses are timed. You can't just sit around. Delilah won't wait forever until you say what you are going to say. If you don't respond, that is a response. And finally, maybe most importantly to the game design ultimately, every dialogue option is a choice the game can remember. The game never tells you this, but we as the designers are constantly tracking not only everything you're saying, but a lot of what you're actually doing in the game. We're always tracking that under the surface so that we can come back and use it later, and I'm going to be talking more about that going forward. The reason that these were so important to our game, or one of the reasons they were so important to our game, is you spend the entire game in communication with a single person. If that didn't feel very real and very convincing, the whole game wouldn't have worked at all. I don't think Firewatch would have been successful if dialogue felt like that sort of repeating loop that you go through, or if things you said didn't end up having an effect later. Those things I think were really important to sustaining a long relationship over the course of several hours with another character who you have to believe is a human being. There were a few other requirements beyond dialogue that we set for ourselves. One is that we wanted the game to be told entirely from the player's first-person perspective, no cutting away to cutscenes or long animated sequences. Two, the world should be totally interconnected. We didn't want different levels. We wanted one big environment. We really wanted to communicate the scale of this forest and the game's theme of sort of isolation and getting lost in the wilderness. We wanted the player to understand that because the environment was all connected. And then finally, we wanted the story to take place in the present, not the past. A lot of story-driven games have the player discover a story that happened before they got there. And our game has that as well, but we wanted the story from the past to directly connect to the story that is happening to the player right now while they're playing the game. We wanted the player to be a participant in the story, not an archaeologist of it. These principles, I think, have been used really well in games like Half-Life and BioShock, games like that. But one thing those games have in common that we do not have is that those games use combat to sort of fill up the space and time and give the player something to do while they're getting between the story beats. We did not want to do that in our game, so what do we do instead? That's what we had to figure out. So since the game was primarily story-driven, we actually decided to just design the story structure of the game before we solved that other big challenge. Our writer, Sean, made a prototype of the opening story in Twine, which is a very simple interactive fiction game-making tool that anyone can download. And when he made this, it was actually just so that all of us on the team could all get on the same page about the game's main character, Henry, and his story. It wasn't intended to be part of the game originally. And it was really useful for us to all sort of play through the Twine and understand who Henry was, and it kind of put us all on the same page. But we didn't know how we were actually going to communicate that information to the player. So this is a common problem in story-based games. How is the player supposed to know who their character is? In real life, you don't need anyone to tell you the experiences you've had. You just know them. But a player of a game doesn't necessarily know what happened to their character. So sometimes a game will explain it in a cutscene, or sometimes the character has amnesia, so it makes sense that they don't know who they are. Sometimes you find these things out by piecing together clues from the game. You sort of learn about your character from the world. But at a certain point we said, well, you know what? Why don't we just let the player play through their character's backstory through that Twine we designed? And we liked the idea of it, but we thought, is that too much text? Is a player going to want to just read a bunch of paragraphs while they're playing a video game that's supposed to be a big 3D world? We didn't know if it was going to work. So to explain how we got past that problem, there was this game called 30 Flights of Loving that was made as a reward for a Kickstarter that a few of us did for a video game podcast that we do called Idle Thumbs. It's kind of it's a weird thing I just said, but this is like a 10-minute game. It's a really short game by this guy, Brendan Chung, who's brilliant, and it uses these quick cuts to tell a fragmented story that you piece together. And I'll show you the trailer. It'll give you an idea of what I mean. So that's a trailer, but the real game is kind of like that. The actual game has these really quick cuts, not quite as fast as that, but pretty fast. And we thought, wow, that's a really interesting way to tell a story in a game, and people don't usually do that. You see that kind of thing in movies, but not games very often. And we thought, maybe that could actually solve this problem for us in the prologue. Maybe we can cut back and forth between the text and other gameplay sections. And it ended up being it made a lot of sense, because when you start the game, you're playing through, you're learning about Henry's backstory, but you're also hiking up to the fire tower, and this actually mirrors the experience Henry himself is having, because as he is making that hike up to the fire tower, he himself is also thinking back to the experiences he's had in his life that brought him to this point. So it actually became a really elegant way to both give the player a lot of information by just giving them a lot of text that they can read through and make choices about, but also communicate the theme of the game and Henry's own interiority. We were very pleased about that. And we didn't tell anyone this before the game came out, so when there were no previews, no press about this section, so it also ended up being kind of a marketing advantage, because when the game came out and people streamed it on Twitch and all this was a total surprise, and people had no idea what they were getting into. So that was a side benefit. So here are the requirements I gave you before, just to remind you. Interconnected world, always in first person, and story is in the present. In an open world game, usually the player is free to kind of travel the world at their own will and experience the story as they encounter it. But we wanted our story to be paced really carefully, like a story traditionally is. So how are we going to do that if the player can go wherever they want at any time? We came up with this idea of days. I watched the movie, when we were coming up with this, I watched the movie Dallas Buyers Club, and there's this scene early in the movie where Matthew McConaughey's character learns he has AIDS, and he's told he has about 30 days to live. And then suddenly the movie cuts and it says day one. And you realize, oh my God, we're going to count the days until this character's death, basically. And it's like this terrible moment. And I thought that was such a brilliant way of organizing the movie. And I said, why don't we split our game up into those? It makes sense with the theme of our game as well, because we know Henry's only out here for a limited amount of time. And once weird things start happening, the player is going to wonder, like, how is this going to get wrapped up? Like, we know Henry's only out here for a few months, or is he? Like, the days ended up providing a sense of tension and giving, on a gameplay side, a really clear way to divide up the game. So we could do something interesting, which was we could have day one gameplay, day 2, day 3, but then we can skip right to day 9. We can do what a book or a film does or whatever, which is just cut out the uninteresting things through editing. We can basically use the day system as a way to edit our game. And that was really, really useful. But it kind of had a downside as well, which is that players didn't necessarily know when these cuts were going to happen. And so this ended up actually having a negative effect on the open quality of our game. Because players, I think, because the day's ending was usually a surprise, players didn't know that they were actually free to explore the world and find side content and take their time playing the game. So that was something that maybe didn't work quite as well as we wanted it to, even though the day system did give us a lot of benefit in terms of pacing and editing. So every decision you make like this in the structure of your game can have side effects that you didn't necessarily want it to have. For instance, there's this old burned out cabin in the game, and you can find these song lyrics, and if you tell Delilah about it, she'll tell you this long, kind of stupid, scary story about raccoons, and it's really complicated interactive dialogue, and you can interrupt her and talk about other things, and then she'll pick the story back up and keep talking about it. It's maybe the most complicated piece of interactive dialogue in our game, but most players never saw it because they didn't know that they could go off the main path and go find other things. I don't know if we necessarily made the wrong decision about that, but I think if we were making this game again, we could make the same choice we made, but do it a little better by giving players more clues that they could go off the beaten path. So let's get to how we actually built all this content. We made a system that we called our event system, and it was the way that we triggered dialogue and other gameplay logic. And not only can this display dialogue, it can also set simple variables called facts behind the scenes based on whatever the player's doing in the game. And then using those, it can trigger more dialogue or any of the other kind of narrative or gameplay events in our games. It's a very simple system, but that makes it very powerful, because if we wanted to just hook up a bunch of very simple facts and events to each other, if we just did the work of hooking it all up, we could make very complex interactions from this very simple system. Here's a really simple example. When you play through that text introduction, the whole time you're playing through it, the game is recording all of the results that you choose into our event system. And then over the course of the game, dialogue much later is using those responses to influence what happens in the game. And that's everything from the really kind of silly decisions, like what you name your dog, all the way up to how you reacted to your wife Julia's illness. And then once we track any of your choices in the game, we can always go back to them later. And this was a really useful thing for us, especially when it came to playtesting. We actually built the game in time order. So we built day 1 first, then we built day 2, then we built day 3, all the way to the end. And this meant that we could playtest the game as we were building it, and as players came back to playtest more, they could pick up where they left off. So here's another example of some content we built. On day 1, you encounter these girls in a lake near your tower, and they've been setting off fireworks, and you have to go stop them. So using the event system, the game is watching and tracking all of the things Henry is doing as he reacts to this. Depending on what the player decides to do, the teens will have different reactions to Henry, and it will affect how that scene plays out for you. And then at the end, Henry describes what happens to Delilah. But you can also lie to Delilah. You can tell her it went a different way than it actually did. So we, as the designers of the game, we know what happened, but we also know what you said happened, whether or not that's the same thing. And so later in the game, we can refer to any of that data to change dialogue or whatever else we wanted. And the scene with teen girls really benefited from playtesting. Watching people play the game was extremely valuable, and people had lots of ideas that we definitely would not have had on our own. For instance, you can take their stereo and throw it in the lake. And that just came from a playtester who thought that would be a funny thing to do. And we said, yeah, that is a funny thing to do. Let's make that actually do stuff in the game. And this became one of the most talked about moments in our early gameplay videos, to the point that a lot of players thought that that was like the solution to the scene. A lot of players saw that in a video, said, oh, you have to throw the stereo in the lake. But you don't. You can also leave the stereo where it is, you can take it with you, you can turn it off, you can throw it on the ground, and all those things will have different effects on the teens. And if you can even take it with you and hold it up here while you're talking to Delilah, and she will notice that the radio is playing and tell you to turn it down because it's too loud. Like, all those different things have different effects on the game. It was a pretty complex scene because most of the scenes in our game didn't have other people in them. But doing all that playtesting really made us able to understand the potential of that scene. And I think a lot of people don't think that story-based games need as much playtesting as systems-based games, but they do. It taught us a couple things here. You're not going to think of everything that your players will think of, so you need to watch them to understand what they think is going to be interesting and like correct, because you might not have thought of the exact same thing. Also, you can treat any part of your game, including just dialogue and walking around and looking at things, you can treat that as an actual system. Your game doesn't need to be about combat and sort of physics and all these things to have systems in it. We set facts and change dialogue based on all kinds of things, not just what you say, but where you're looking, the order that you walked in different places. All of those things, we treated them like systems. Look for ways to do surprising things that your players will notice and will make them feel like their playthrough is special. That's so important. Even in a game without a lot of gameplay, if you make the gameplay you do have react to the player, it really pays off. So we found that dialogue was the cheapest way to pay this off, because dialogue, at least in our game, because your other character was over a radio, it was a very cost-effective way to put in lots of this reactivity. If we thought of a funny thing to do based on like some action the player took, we could pay it off really easily by just having the voice actor who played Delilah, Cissy Jones, we could just have her record a few extra lines. And if we bundled those all into one extra voice session, it was a very small budget impact on the game, but it paid off really big because the player who sees that special thing happen after they try something weird, it really, really hits them big because they wouldn't expect the game to actually react to what they did, and it didn't cost us very much to put that in the game. Dialogue is much cheaper than like lots of animation and lots of new art assets and all that, and we really, really leaned on that a lot. So keep a lookout for surprises in your game. Always be looking for ways to take advantage of whatever system your game has to surprise players and do something new. Here's a funny example. On day 33 in our game, Delilah tells Henry to go pick up some food from a supply box and don't take more than he needs. Only take, his box that says Henry on it, don't take the rest. And as the player, you can just use the game's normal pickup system to pick up however much of the food you want, either your own food or someone else's food. You can throw it over the cliff if you want. You can do whatever you want. And if you only take your own food, the game just continues. But if you take more food than you're supposed to, the game actually inserts a whole nother day into the game, which is day 34, which is just this short little day, and the whole day consists of Delilah just like getting mad at you for being greedy and taking all this extra food. So it's this whole extra little thing that only exists for players who tried this other action. And it was really cheap for us to implement because the game all takes place in one big environment, so we didn't need to make any new art assets. All we had to do is record some extra dialogue and put in some extra gameplay scripting, and then for the players who find that, it feels like this amazing thing that happened. So when a playthrough feels like it belongs to you, it's a great feeling. And once we realized the power of this, we realized that it was more effective and cost-effective for us than a sort of traditional RPG kind of branching endings or branching story. In Firewatch, we never give the player this like A and B choice. We never say, here's the good choice, here's the bad choice. We just treat everything as a potential choice. We just always are looking at what the player's doing and deciding if there are ways we can make that action have a consequence later. There are definitely players who wished that they could get a different ending. There are definitely players who wanted that. But for the story we were telling, we thought there was one best ending that actually reflected these characters. It might not be the happiest ending, but it was the one that we thought was most true to the characters, and we didn't think there was an honest way to make that ending branch. And that's how it is in life, right? You can't always change the big things that happen to you. So our systems were hiding under the surface. It's not a big systems-heavy game, obviously, but we put a lot under there. A lot of players, I think, don't realize how much game there is sort of underneath our game. But if they had an experience that felt like it was theirs, it still worked for them. And so, really, all of this factored into our ultimate goal, which was to tell a convincing story about real adults who live in the real world, or something pretty close to it. And even, the events of the game, the story that happens in Firewatch is kind of weird, but it's not supernatural or impossible. It's not a science fiction story or a fantasy story. And, most of the time, the really big events in your life are actually out of your control. That has certainly been true for me. I've definitely had things in my life that I had absolutely no control over and could not have stopped from happening, even if I would have wanted to. But you can react to these things in different ways, and that's the control that most of us have, and that's where most of the choices happen in this game as well. Your choices still matter, even if they don't necessarily change the ending, and we wanted the game to reflect that. And when we started making the game from a design standpoint, we had, like I said, we had all these different mechanical ideas for how to make it interesting, with the sort of mapping things out or complex environment traversal, doing the firefinding, all that kind of thing. But ultimately we realized that given what the game was actually about, the most interesting part for us was to explore these really detailed interactions between these two characters in as much detail as we possibly could. And from that came our real core gameplay, which was trying to respond to the player's choices as fully and as interestingly and frequently as we possibly could, especially as they relate to that core relationship between the two characters. And so we let that guide our design process. And while we would definitely do some things differently if we were making Firewatch again, we think that it basically worked. So that's what I have for you in terms of the presentation. And we are now going to do some Q&A here with Arthur. But I hope that was interesting to you. And there you go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah, thank you.
So guys, Chris was talking about Firewatch. Why am I here? I'm Arthur Protazio, and also a narrative designer. Worked on different games, always with a very focused storytelling approach. And if you guys are like me, you've also played Firewatch. How many people played Firewatch here? Awesome. So I'm going to ask you guys, well, we're going to have some conversations here and ask for questions as well on your behalf. But in the meantime, please, all of you who raised your hands, think of at least just one scene from Firewatch that moved you, that you remember. And then we'll get back to you in a while because I want to have some back and forth with what you remember of Firewatch as well. So what we're doing here is actually, we want to delve deeper into what Chris just presented. As you can see, narrative design is game design in the sense that how can you convey the experience of a story in a game without actually thinking of the system you're using in your favor. From that approach, what I was really fascinated by, Chris, was the fact that you made it pretty clear that developing games is not only an artistic and cultural activity, but also it has a budgetary nature to it. So using dialogue as this narrative technique to be able to tell the story you wanted to tell, but still be able to keep things cost effective, that was really smart. And I keep thinking about one specific question which is connected to Delilah, actually. Which is, so in games like Portal, we see GLaDOS interacting with the player all the time, and until a certain point in the game, GLaDOS is just a voice file. And Delilah is a voice file, right? But unlike Portal, you never get to see Delilah. And from a narrative point, could you tell us a bit more about that? Why do you never get to see Delilah? Or what was it always the intention to never reveal her? How does that tie into the more personal aspect of the game?
Yeah, that's a good question. There were definitely a lot of players who were very upset that they didn't get to meet Delilah. We definitely got a lot of angry messages about that. But I really think, so, like I said in the presentation, there are things that if we were making Firewatch again, there are definitely some things we would do differently. There are things I think we could improve on. That's always true with any project you work on. It was definitely true for this project. But I personally would not change that element of it. I think that the way the game ends is the most appropriate. I think it's the truest version of how these characters would act. I think once you know Henry, and especially once you know Delilah, you understand that the way this game ends was the only way that that relationship was going to end up. And, like you said, we also knew budgetarily we weren't going to get to build Delilah. That wasn't something that was in the cards. We weren't going to have a fully rigged and animated photorealistic person walking around. It just wasn't happening. We never even really considered it, honestly. But what that meant was we had to tell a story that didn't suffer because of that. We had to tell a story that made it clear who this character is and why it ends up the way it does. For me, when we were working on this game, I thought a lot about experiences you have in your life. I think most people have had this. By the time you're an adult, you have had this at some point in your life. Some period of time, maybe it could only be a couple days. I mean, it could be all the way up to a year, where something you have some part of your life that when you look back on it, it almost feels like it was a dream, or you were a different person, or you were living some other reality. You know, I think a lot of people have that when they go to university, or, you know, when their early relationships, I think, can often feel that way. You know, it feels like you're living some kind of strange other experience. And at the time, it feels like your entire reality. But then you look back on it later, and it's like this different person. And I really, that was something I kept thinking about when we were making Firewatch. Like, that's what this was for Henry. He got so caught up in this mystery, and he got so caught up in Delilah, and he got so caught up in all these things. And he's, you know, it was this entire little universe that all fit into the summer of his life, and it was always going to end. It was never going to become his new life. It was always going to be something that stayed in his past, and we thought that was just really important to communicate in the game. So that was a longer answer than you probably needed, but there you go.
No, it actually tied into a lot of other topics. For example, so you mentioned the idea of Henry's summer, and one immediate reference that came to mind when you were talking about not only about the day structure, so day 1, day 2, day 3, day 9, etc. It made me remember of the movie Requiem for a Dream from Aronofsky, which you have summer, and then you have autumn, and then you have the seasons, like promoting these edits in the experience. And if you think about it, what are trips, what are holidays, vacations? It's always like this sort of surreal experience that you get to enjoy, but it's never part of your daily life. It's just this, so whenever you come back for a trip, let's say you had an awesome vacation, I like to say that whenever you come back, you have a vacation hangover. Yeah. So you're always like, oh man, it was so cool, I wish I could still be there. And I do think, in a way, the experience that Firewatch promotes, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, even the ending, I mean, does that tie into the idea that perhaps that was some sort of, from an emotional and narrative perspective, sort of a healing experience for Henry? So his life was going on, and then this new phase comes in.
Maybe. I mean, it really depends. I think that actually, whether it was a healing experience for him or not, I think depends a lot more on the player. I think each player is going to have a different version of that, and depending on what dialogue choices they went down, Henry is going to have different ideas about what this means for his life and how much. I mean, you can play the game, like, for instance, one of the ways I played the game, you know, as a designer to try and figure out what we needed to do, one of the things I did was play through the game without ever voluntarily replying to Delilah. So there are obviously times in the game where Henry, you know, just has one response and he says it, but a lot of the choices, like I said in the talk, you can just time out, not respond, and Henry just won't say anything. And so I played through the game once by literally never answering any of those. And again, I did that for two reasons. One was a technical reason, which was to make sure that the game still worked. You know, it was to make sure that, like, there weren't any bugs if a player just didn't want to answer Delilah ever. But then there's this also thing, this other part creatively of, does the whole thing even make sense still? You know, does the player actually still get the story information they need, even if they're very quiet and only respond when they have to? And you know, if you do that, you're not going to learn that much about Delilah, and you're not going to learn, Henry's not going to come to a lot of new conclusions about his own life. And so that player who plays that way is going to have a very different experience than the player who opens up to Delilah, shares everything with her, and then learns more about her as well. I mean, you can learn all kinds of things about Delilah's personal life that might have relevance to Henry's life, but only if you know, engage in the content a certain way. So I think, you know, what this experience means to Henry, I think, is going to change based on the player. Definitely.
It's. I like to think of it as, if we take a look at these sort of games, either narrative-driven, etc., you do have, of course, like you mentioned, different branching structures. I mean, like smaller branching structures in the dialogues. But the major arc, the major experience, if you think about it, it could be like an ice cream. You have chocolate-flavored ice cream. You have strawberry-flavored ice cream. You have the same structure. You have the same system. But you do have variations in it which are caused by the player's decisions. But the ending is the same, for example. However, the way you react to the ending is based on your decisions. And then what's interesting is we're talking about this experience, but at the end of the day, we are talking about a sort of game, which is a narrative-driven game, which could be in some ways compared to a walking simulator. And then the question that begs to be asked is, we've seen a lot of games like Dear Esther back in the day. We've seen a lot of examples that are either successful or not, and Firewatch was a successful example. So the question is, how do you see this genre playing out in the game industry? I mean, is this something of a niche product or not? Or do you think the fact that it was walking simulator was just basically the structure that you used as a starting ground, and then from that on you built upon it?
We didn't really decide to be or not be a walking simulator. There were definitely people who put the game in that category, and that's fine. Doesn't bother us. You know, I've worked on Gone Home and 30 Flights of Loving, both of which are also probably in the sort of walking simulator category, so I have no problem with that. But we did, so when I was putting those bullet points up about some of our principles, one of them was the game's story should take place in the present, not in the past. That was actually a choice. We made that choice for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was because we didn't want to have that sort of vibe that a lot of walking simulators have, where all of the story has already happened before you even got there, and you're just figuring out what it was. And there's nothing wrong with that structure at all, by the way. Like, that's a very powerful structure, but we really wanted to try and go a different way. We wanted Henry to be in the middle of a story that was happening to him. You know, I mean, this is a spoiler, but like, Henry gets punched out in the game. Henry sees these people, like a guy walking around. Henry like infiltrates this weird place and finds things he thinks is evidence, you know. And we wanted him to be right in the middle of this thing that was happening. So I don't know that necessarily matters to, if you're the kind of person who just doesn't like walking simulators and just thinks they're sort of not games or whatever, you probably still won't think Firewatch is a game, and that's fine. But we did want to try and tackle some different problems than other games in that category try and tackle. And also, one of the reasons we really doubled down on the reactivity and kind of your choices getting tracked by the game and potentially having an impact later. Again, we wanted to have that feeling of being a game with interactivity. Like, we really wanted that sensation that even though Firewatch is a pretty linear story, we still did want it to feel like a big interactive system that you are part of. We thought that was pretty important.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the wilderness as a playground, both from a narrative and a systemic perspective, I mean, you even have the option of just wandering around the game with not a specific narrative-driven experience and just use it as a playground, right?
Yep. Yeah, when we brought the game out on Xbox One, we released a mode called Free Roam mode, and then we brought that to the other platforms as well, so you can play it on any version of the game. And there's no story in it. It's just the forest. And, like, you know, no one would buy our game just for that, obviously. Like, you buy the game because of the story. But we did put a lot of work into making the forest big and beautiful and just fun to walk around in. And so we thought, yeah, why not? We'll put in a mode of the game that just is that. You can listen to the music, you can just relax, and kind of, there's the walking simulator. So I guess we've shipped a walking simulator inside of Firewatch as well. I never thought about that till right now.
But if you think about it, I mean, it's the wilderness provides this sort of like contemplative experience, this situation in which Firewatch is very introspective, right? So the fact that you're in the wilderness and you have even the option to use your camera to take pictures, it makes sense that at some point you just want to. I like the mode you guys put together. It feels to me as if it were just like that free day, Henry's free day.
Right.
You know,
yeah, totally.
Day, whatever, 15, and you're like, just, I want to take the day off and just wander around.
It's the day we edit it out.
Yeah, exactly. Can we hear some of the scenes that you guys have in mind? Do we have a microphone for the audience? Awesome. We want questions. And the scenes. We want the scenes as well.
Vou começar com umas perguntas que o pessoal mandou aqui pelo aplicativo do Big Festival, e daí eu vejo as cenas ali rapidinho, tá? In English, okay? How do you feel about spoilers? Do you believe they ruin the narrative experience or enhance it?
That's a good question. I am kind of a hypocrite about this because I think it is very difficult to have interesting conversations about a story without being able to talk about everything the story contains. If you cannot talk about, interesting details or spoilers that happen, it's very difficult to say, have a meaningful discussion about what you experienced. So I think it's important for people to be able to do that. But the reason I'm a hypocrite is because I don't live by that rule in my own life at all. If for instance, if there's a movie coming out that I know I want to see, I will avoid any trailers. I will not read anything. I am so hardcore about avoiding spoilers in my own life. And my wife is the exact opposite. She will read the Wikipedia page of a movie's plot summary all in advance, before we go in, and I'm like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this to yourself? But it doesn't hurt the experience for her. We have our, we're similar in a lot of ways, but in some ways we have different brains. And so I kind of know from experience that this is really different to everybody, and there's not really a way to have one answer. But I will say that as a game developer, if there's something in your game that you do actually think would damage the experience or take away some of your ability to kind of market or sell your game before it comes out, just don't tell anyone. We didn't, then there can't be spoiled, at least until the game comes out. Like I said in the presentation, we didn't talk about the prologue until the game came out, and it was like watching people play that on Twitch was amazing because, a lot of really sad stuff happens in that prologue, and we saw all the people in chat crying emoji and all that, and it really felt big to them because they didn't know any of that was coming. And also, we didn't really even tell people what we told people that there was a mystery in the game, that was pretty obvious from the trailer, but a lot of people were like, is it aliens? Is it the government? Is it ghosts? What is it? And we just never said anything about that at all before the game came out. So, I do think that when you're marketing your game, it is important to not just put everything out there and spoil it all before anyone has a chance to play it.
Cool. Outra pergunta, another question. What are your thoughts about the term walking simulator for narrative-driven games with little to no focus on what gamers perceive as gameplay?
Well, I think we kind of covered that question actually with Arthur. I think whatever people want to call games is fine, but I think, games in that category are definitely still games. I think a lot of people don't understand how many systems go into even very simple games. All games are interactive software, and, just because some have more complicated mechanics than others doesn't really take away from that.
And several questions regarding this. How is it like to work at Valve?
Ask me in a year. I don't really know yet, to be honest with you.
Okay. You want to go through the scenes?
Yeah, sure. We can hear from the audience a few scenes that were really special to you guys in Firewatch. Any raised hands?
Só levantar a mão que eu vou até aí para a gente ver. Quem quiser compartilhar.
There we go. I was trying to...
Só fala teu nome e pode falar.
Okay. I'm called Vitor Malcher, and a scene that really catch me, I guess, in the game was really close to the end, that I realized that nothing of that mystery, I'm going to spoil it a bit, I guess. So nothing of the mystery was actually real, and I don't know, I kind of related to the main character in a way that reality isn't always your as you're expected to be, and your real life is going to hit you anyway, and your problems are going to come back. And at that moment, I really felt like it was a real story. It was a real character, and I don't know. It just messed with me in a way that any other game has, like in the best. And I think it's great.
Thank you so much. That means a lot. Definitely a lot of people did not like that part of it, so so it's always nice to hear from the people who did. Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly correct. I think your analysis is right on. I think it's really easy as humans to want to see patterns and stories in everything, and that's a good instinct we have. We're a storytelling species, but not everything in your life always works that way, and it's important to have stories that communicate that part of life as well, I think.
And from an artistic perspective, do you think, because all the time we're talking about storytelling in games, and we've got like huge RPGs, take 30 hours to finish, we've got all sorts of games and different types of experiences, but Firewatch, thank you for the scene, and thank you for your account of how you felt playing Firewatch. What I think is amazing is, how do you think that plays out into Firewatch games as this expressive medium? I mean, we're talking about a story that is not your typical Save the Galaxy story. And it feels very real, but feeling real can also mean that it feels hard to take it in.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things that is difficult often in game storytelling is to communicate interiority, by which I mean like communicating what's going on inside a character's head. That's something that books are really great at, and like that's what books basically are. You're reading what's going on in characters' heads. And then movies have challenges in that regard, but I think directors have found interesting ways to communicate that. And then games, it's even more of a challenge. I think it is proven very, very difficult in games to communicate the interiority of a character's mind to the player, because the player has to be physically present in the world the whole time. It's really hard to sort of escape into something that just conveys the mental state of a character. So that's something we tried to do in the prologue to the game, and hopefully over the course of the game we gave the player enough of what was going on in Henry's brain that they were able to sort of fill in those gaps. Actually, that was something we tried to do with the dialogue system. So like when you have 3 choices of dialogue on the screen, one of the ways I thought about that, and like Sean, the writer of the game, one of the ways we talked about it was like all of those are the things that are actually going through Henry's mind right now, which sounds obvious, but different games do this differently. So if you play Mass Effect or something, your choices are not both what's happening in that character's brain. Those choices are like, you're actually defining a different character by making those choices. You're defining the sort of good character or the bad character, not good or bad, you know what I mean, the sort of aggressive character or the peaceful character or whatever. But in Firewatch, that's not really what it is. Henry is a specific character. Like, you're not creating a character in Firewatch, but what you are doing is you're sort of navigating through this character's mind. So, you're taking a personality that is already there when the game begins, and you're sort of guiding it through all these different thoughts that he's having, and you're deciding which one is dominant. That was actually something that I remember. So we were inspired in some ways by like the adventure games, the LucasArts adventure games of the early 1990s, and I worked with both Ron Gilbert and Tim Schafer, who were really like major figures in those games, and I have so much respect for their work. And I remember I don't remember which of them it was, or maybe both of them, but they talked about that as well, that the player is kind of like the conscience of the character. So like the character is an actual person that's not you, but you're kind of like the little angel or devil on their shoulder, kind of like pushing them through these decisions. And that's kind of how we thought about, it's not exactly the same, but it's kind of how we thought about Firewatch as well.
Awesome.
Nosso tempo acabou. Our time is over. Sorry.
Oh, no. Okay.
Gente, palmas para Chris, para Arthur.
Thank you for coming.
I'm gonna say sorry because our time is over, but
Oh, that's okay.
Quem quiser conversar com o Chris, com o Arthur, eles estão aqui no Big Festival, vocês podem conversar depois. Agradeço a presença de todos. Baixem o aplicativo do Big Festival para mandar perguntas também. E até daqui a pouco no próximo painel aqui nessa sala. Obrigado.